People will pick a worse bet, on purpose, if the odds are just clearer. That single sentence describes one of the strangest, most reliable quirks in human decision-making, and once you see it, you start noticing it in almost every meeting room you sit in. It's called the Ellsberg Paradox, named after the economist who first demonstrated it in 1961. His name might sound familiar for other reasons entirely, but before Daniel Ellsberg became known for anything else in his life, he ran a simple experiment that has quietly reshaped how economists and psychologists think about risk. In 1961, he wasn't yet a household name. He was an economist interested in a narrow, almost dry-sounding question. Do people actually behave the way classical decision theory says they should? When the odds are perfectly identical but the source of those odds isn't equally trustworthy? The experiment he built to answer that question was deliberately stripped down. No dramatic stakes, no complicated setup, just 2 containers and a simple bet, precisely so that nothing except the ambiguity itself could explain any difference in how people chose. Here's what the experiment actually looked like. Picture 2 urns sitting on a table in front of you. Both of them, you're told, contain red balls and black balls in a 50-50 split. Reach in, draw a ball, and if you guess the color right, you win. In pure mathematical terms, betting on either urn should feel like exactly the same decision. 50-50 is 50-50, no matter which urn the ball comes from. A coin doesn't care which pocket it's flipped from. If you handed a strict logician both options and asked which to bet on, the honest answer would be that it doesn't matter. Flip a mental coin between the 2 urns themselves and move on, because the expected value is identical either way. But there's one crucial difference between the 2 urns, and it isn't about the odds themselves. It's about what you're allowed to know about them. One urn's composition has been confirmed. You can inspect it, or you're told directly and reliably that it holds exactly 50 red balls and 50 black balls. The other urn is a mystery. You're told the overall odds are still 50-50 in theory, but you have no way to confirm the actual mix inside. It could be 50-50. It could be lopsided in some way nobody's told you about. You simply don't know, and you can't find out before you bet. When Ellsberg ran this experiment, almost everyone chose to bet on the confirmed urn. Not most people, almost everyone. Given the identical odds on paper, participants overwhelmingly preferred the option where the odds were verified over the option where the odds were merely claimed to be the same. And here's the part that should stop you cold. The math says these 2 choices should be indifferent. If the odds really are 50-50 in both urns, and you have no reason to doubt that claim, betting on one should be exactly as good as betting on the other. There is no rational reason, in a purely probabilistic sense, to favor the confirmed urn over the unconfirmed one. And yet, over and over, in Ellsberg's original experiment, and in every replication run since, people favor the confirmed urn anyway, decisively, consistently, almost universally. Economists at the time found this deeply unsettling, not because the result was hard to observe, it was easy to observe and easy to replicate, but because it broke an assumption that had quietly underpinned decades of economic theory, that people evaluate choices based on stated probabilities alone. Ellsberg's urns showed that people evaluate something else entirely alongside the probability, namely, how much they trust the probability itself, and that second layer of judgment doesn't show up anywhere in the classic mathematics of expected value. This is where the distinction that makes the Ellsberg paradox genuinely useful comes in, because it isn't simply about people disliking risk. Everyone already knows people are risk-averse in the ordinary sense. They'd rather have a guaranteed $100 than a coin flip for $200. That's a well-understood, well-studied preference, and it makes intuitive sense. What Ellsberg's urns expose is something narrower and stranger. It's not risk itself that people are avoiding. Both urns, remember, carry the exact same stated risk, 50-50. What people are avoiding is not knowing how solid that risk estimate actually is. This specific flavor of aversion has its own name in behavioral economics: ambiguity aversion. We don't just dislike bad odds. We dislike odds we can't verify, even when we have no actual evidence they're worse. Think about why that might be. Psychologically, because it's not simply irrational noise. When you bet on the confirmed earn and lose, you can tell yourself a clean story. The odds were 50-50, I lost a coin flip, that's just variance, nothing to learn here. When you bet on the unconfirmed earn and lose, there's an extra, nagging possibility sitting underneath the loss. Maybe the odds were never really 50-50 at all. Maybe I got played by uncertainty I couldn't see into. That second kind of loss feels worse, even when, mathematically, it shouldn't. Because part of what we're protecting against isn't just financial loss, it's the discomfort of not being able to explain the loss afterward. Ambiguity doesn't just threaten your outcome, it threatens your ability to make sense of your own decision after the fact. There's a kind of second-order regret baked into ambiguous losses that clean, well-defined losses simply don't carry. And most people, without ever formalizing it this way, are quietly pricing that second-order regret into every choice they make. Now take this exact pattern and walk it straight into an ordinary workplace, because it shows up constantly, usually disguised as sound business judgment. Start with vendor selection, a decision every manager eventually faces. A manager needs to choose between two vendors. One is the safe, familiar option, the one the company has used for years, the one everyone already knows how to work with. The other is newer, and on paper, its numbers actually look better. Better performance metrics, better pricing, better reviews from other clients. But the newer vendor is, by definition, less known. Fewer years of track record. Fewer war stories from people inside the building who've actually worked with them under pressure. So the manager picks the familiar vendor anyway, even with the better numbers sitting right there on the newer one's proposal. Here's the thing worth naming directly, because it's easy to blur. The new vendor's risk is unknown. That is not the same statement as the new vendor's risk is higher. Those two ideas get treated as interchangeable in a decision-maker's gut, but they are not the same fact at all. Unknown risk simply means you don't yet have the information to rate it confidently. Unknown feels worse than bad but known, even when unknown might genuinely be better. And that gap between feeling and fact is exactly where the Ellsberg Paradox lives inside a procurement decision. Ask that manager directly why they picked the familiar vendor, and they'll usually reach for a reasonable-sounding justification, something about stability, or continuity, or not wanting to disrupt an existing workflow. Rarely will anyone say, out loud, in a meeting, that they simply couldn't stomach the discomfort of betting on numbers they hadn't personally watched hold up over time. But that discomfort, more often than the stated reasons, is doing most of the actual work behind the decision. The same pattern shows up in hiring, maybe even more sharply, because hiring decisions carry a personal reputational cost that vendor decisions usually don't. A hiring team reviews two candidates. One has a traditional, familiar resume, the expected sequence of schools and job titles that hiring managers have seen 1,000 times before and know exactly how to evaluate. The other candidate took a non-traditional path, a career switch, a self-taught skill set, an unconventional sequence of roles that doesn't map cleanly onto the usual template. Teams reject the non-traditional candidate constantly, and when you ask why, the reason given is rarely that the resume itself is weak. It's usually something vaguer. Not sure about the fit, hard to gauge how they perform here, feels like a gamble. Translate that honestly, and what it actually means is, this candidate's odds of success are harder to estimate. Not necessarily worse, just harder to estimate. And that uncertainty alone is enough to tip the decision toward whoever looks more legible on paper, regardless of who might actually perform better on the job. Legibility, in other words, quietly outcompetes ability whenever ambiguity aversion is running the process, and it does so without anyone in the room ever consciously deciding to prioritize the familiar resume over the stronger candidate. There's a slower, quieter version of this same bias that plays out over months instead of a single decision, and it shows up as a mediocre process that survives long after everyone privately agrees it isn't working. A known mediocre process has one enormous advantage over any replacement. Its flaws are already fully mapped. Everyone in the building knows exactly where it breaks, exactly how bad the worst case looks, exactly what workaround to reach for when it fails, because it fails the same way it always has. Replacing it means facing a transition with genuinely unclear risk, a new set of failure modes nobody has catalogued yet, a period where nobody knows exactly what will go wrong or how badly. So the mediocre process survives, not because anyone believes it's good, but because its badness is at least fully known. And known badness, it turns out, is psychologically easier to tolerate than unknown potential. There's something almost backwards about this if you say it plainly out loud. An organization will often protect a process everyone privately dislikes, purely because disliking it consistently feels safer than being surprised by something new, even something better. Pilot programs run into a related wall, one worth naming on its own because it explains a specific kind of organizational paralysis. Leadership frequently wants something close to a guaranteed outcome before committing real resources to a new initiative. They want the pilot's numbers locked down, the risk fully quantified, the ambiguity squeezed out entirely, before they'll sign off on scaling it. But by definition, nothing new comes with that kind of guarantee attached. If the outcome were already fully certain, it wouldn't really be a pilot in any meaningful sense. It would just be an expansion of something already proven. Demanding certainty before committing to something inherently new isn't caution. It's a way of ensuring that nothing genuinely new ever clears the bar, because the bar itself was built to be impossible to clear by anything unproven. Ellsberg didn't stop at urns and coin flips. He went on to apply this exact same insight to a much higher stakes arena, national security work. Officials making consequential decisions, according to his later analysis, routinely chose familiar bad options over unclear better ones. Not because the unclear option was actually worse, because unclear felt riskier to their own careers than familiar but flawed ever would. A bad outcome from a well-worn, expected course of action rarely costs a career the way a bad outcome from an unconventional, harder-to-defend choice does, even when the unconventional choice had genuinely better odds attached to it going in. The ambiguity itself became the threat being managed, not the underlying stakes of the decision. That's a sobering thought to carry into any high-consequence decision, because it means the very people trained to weigh outcomes objectively were, in practice, weighing their own comfort with explaining those outcomes afterward, which is a different calculation entirely, and one that can quietly steer national policy in the same direction it steers a hiring panel. Notice the thread running through every one of these scenarios, from the urns to the vendor to the hiring panel to the pilot program to the officials Ellsberg studied later. In each case, the ambiguous option isn't necessarily the worst bet. It's simply the bet whose quality is harder to state with confidence out loud, in a room, to other people who might later ask you to defend the call. And that difficulty, that discomfort of not being able to fully justify a choice in advance, quietly gets treated as if it were evidence of actual risk, when it's really just a gap in available information. So what's the actual fix here? Because noticing the bias alone doesn't make it disappear. The fix isn't demanding certainty before you act, because certainty about anything genuinely new almost never exists, and waiting for it just guarantees you stay stuck with the familiar option indefinitely, mediocre process and all. The fix is narrower and more useful than that, and it costs almost nothing to apply once you know to look for it. It's noticing, in the moment, when you're rejecting a good option purely because its odds haven't been fully mapped yet. As distinct from rejecting it because you have real evidence, it's worse. Those are two completely different reasons to say no, and most people, most of the time, never separate them out loud. Once you notice that gap, ask a much more specific, much more answerable question. What data would actually close it? Not, is this a risk? Is this an unknown? And if it is, what would it actually take to turn that unknown into a known, one way or the other? Sometimes the honest answer is a small pilot, a reference call, a trial period, a limited test that costs relatively little and would resolve most of the ambiguity directly. Then weigh that specific cost against the ambiguity itself, because ambiguity has a cost too, even though it rarely gets counted as one on any budget line. A mediocre process that survives another year because nobody wanted to face its unclear replacement has a cost, measured in the gap between what it delivers and what a better alternative might have delivered. And that cost accrues quietly, every month, whether or not anyone ever puts a number on it. Most of the time, once you actually price it out, Closing the information gap costs far less than continuing to avoid a good option simply because nobody's confirmed it yet. The next time you catch yourself, or your team, quietly favoring the familiar but flawed choice over the newer option with the better numbers, go back to those two urns from 1961. Ask which one you're actually choosing, and ask honestly whether you're choosing it because the odds are worse or only because nobody's confirmed them yet. More often than you'd expect, you'll find you already know the second urn was never the worst bet at all. You simply hadn't been given permission by anyone, including yourself, to bet on something you couldn't fully verify in advance. It was only the less comfortable one to explain out loud. That single reframe, worse bet versus harder to defend bet, is the whole practical value of knowing this bias exists at all. It won't make ambiguity disappear. It will stop you from mistaking your discomfort with it for actual evidence against the option sitting right in front of you. If you've caught yourself picking the safer sounding option purely because it felt easier to defend, say so in the comments, because that instinct is worth naming out loud before it quietly costs you the better bet.